Thank you so much for listening to the John and Heidi Show this weekend. February is Black History Month, and we're going to be visiting with a guest today about a book that he's recently put out. It's called Separate, The Story of Plessy versus Ferguson, and America's Journey from Slavery to Segregation. Our guest is Steve Luxenberg. Now, Plessy versus Ferguson is synonymous with Jim Crow laws and the unjust doctrine of separate but equal, but few Americans know that much about it, and we're going to visit with Steve Luxenberg about his new book that's hoping to maybe shine a little more light on this subject today. Steve, thank you so much for joining us.
I'm doing well, John.
Well, February is Black History Month, and this particular case that you're talking about here is a pretty pivotal and very important case, isn't it?
It is. It's one of the most famous in Supreme Court history, but we don't like to talk about it much because it sanctioned segregation and led to its spread. So I think of Plessy as the case that almost everyone knows is the separate but equal case, but hardly anyone can describe.
And this is a topic that makes a lot of people very uncomfortable on both sides. But it's a topic that, the discussion needs to happen, doesn't it?
Well, I was inspired in part by a quote from Martin Luther King, who said in 1957 that we fear each other and we don't understand each other because we're separated from each other. And I wanted to understand, and that meant going back into the past and into the history of the Plessy case. And this isn't a book for legal scholars. This is a book for anyone who likes a compelling story. And I was drawn to it because of its contradictions. There were 7 justices in the majority who voted in favor of separate, said separate was okay, and all but one of them were from the North. Now, how does that happen?
Yeah.
And the justice who wrote the decision was from New England. He grew up in an abolitionist neck of the woods, and the only dissenter, Justice Harlan, was the only one who had ever owned slaves in his lifetime. And 40 years later, he had come around to the opposite point of view.
And what time frame did all of this happen? I wish I could say that I was a phenomenal student of history. I tried to be, but I certainly don't remember everything. So what year was this case? The
case was decided in 1896. The case involved separate railroad cars in Louisiana. The legislature there said that the railroads had to run separate cars for blacks and whites, which is a tricky thing in Louisiana because it has a large mixed-race population. And Plessy was chosen as a test. He was an arranged arrest, in part because he was so fair-skinned that the lawyers thought it would cause confusion. And they wanted to emphasize that you can't enforce this law if you can't tell the race of somebody easily when you're walking down the middle of a railroad car. It was up to the conductor to enforce the law. So it was 1896, but separation has its roots not in the South. You can imagine that. In the South before the Civil War, where there was enslaved people, you didn't separate anyone. It's only in the North, where there were free blacks, in the dawn of the railroad age in the 1830s, that some railroad companies decided, we really ought to have separate cars for our black and white passengers. So the North has a cross to bear in this as well.
And it's amazing when you think about this, this little snapshot in history and things that happened then that would never, ever, ever happen today, kind of shows you how far we've come, hasn't it?
Well, of course we've come a very long way, but I think the legacy of Plessy and separation is with us today. I mean, some of the confrontations that you see with police between blacks and whites, blacks and black policemen, these are rooted in some events that happened in the 1870s after the Civil War, when the people of color were given rights under the 14th Amendment, but those rights weren't honored, and white supremacy grew up in the South, and it's still rooted there today. That's why you see things like the white supremacist march in Charlottesville that has a resonance into the 19th century.
Wow, the book is available right now. Steve, thank you so much for taking some time to visit with us about this.
Well, thank you for having me. I've enjoyed the conversation.
Absolutely. Again, the book is called Separate, The Story of Plessy versus Ferguson and America's Journey from Slavery to Segregation. It's available right now. It just came out on February the 12th, so it's a brand new book. But I do have a link in our show notes to make it really easy for you to find a copy of it if you'd be interested in finding that. You can do that in the show notes for today at johnandheidishow.com. Thank you so much for listening this weekend.